Joining me now to talk about this and a whole range of issues that are creeping across the globe is columnist and journalist at the Adelaide Advertiser, Caleb Bond. Welcome, Caleb. Now let's get stuck into this. Joe Biden is letting the Western world down, isn't he?
He is. And I mean, you just look at his performance every time he gets up to give a speech. He's so dithering, he can barely get a word out. I suppose this is something we've not been immune to in Australia ourselves. I mean, Joe Bjelke-Petersen wasn't the best orator in the world, it must be said. But you know, you look at Biden, and he's just not a guy you can have a lot of confidence in. His press secretary will not let him take any questions. In fact, he's been actively told not to take questions. On the odd occasion that he does take questions, he doesn't seem to know what he's doing. He's constantly stumbling over his words. He's not a guy you can have a lot of confidence in. And I think as a result of that, it has a knock-on effect around the world, because when you've basically got a tough cop on the beat, it sends a message that you can't muck around. And that's something that we don't really have at the moment, because he's not a guy you can look up to.
But it's easy to mock Biden, right? Because he's clearly not in full possession of his faculties. Someone's pulling his strings behind the scenes. We know all of that. But this is no laughing matter. What has happened in America? The left have been absolutely emboldened. Cultural Marxism is running rampant. And it's like a contagion. It is creeping across the world because America's meant to be a thought leader for the West.
Well, that's right. You know, we talk about the leader of the free world is meant to be the President of the United States. And if he isn't really in control, it basically opens a vacuum. And that vacuum was created for him by the left in the US, and they've done a very good job of filling it. I mean, they knew what they were playing at when they put Biden up. He was never going to be the best president in the world, but he was the means to justify the ends, basically. He got in, which cleared the room for them to come through with a cultural Marxist agenda. I mean, you look across the US at the moment, there are bizarre debates going on all over the shop. There is a vacuum of culture. And when any country does not have a defined culture or a belief in itself, it opens up room for someone else to take over that. And that's exactly how cultural Marxists work. They slowly beat down a country and the people that live in it to the point where they feel ashamed of the country, to the point where they no longer see it resembling what they once thought it was. And once people have been convinced that there is something wrong with their country, they can sweep in and come in with something very radical. It's textbook stuff. And Biden, by being such an ineffectual guy, is allowing it.
Yeah, it's textbook stuff, as you said, and it's entirely predictable. I mean, many of us have been warning about this for a very long time. But how much concern or faith or confidence should we have in the American people? 120 military officials or retired generals and admirals wrote that they were in a battle for the republic, effectively, a constitutional republic against the forces of Marxism and leftism. Is this a sign that people are waking up to what's going on and they want to reclaim their country again?
Look, I'm sure some people are. There's always going to be a contingent of people who trade in this division. And I think if you look towards the last election and, in fact, the entirety of the Trump presidency, the point was not necessarily from the left to make the country better. It was to sow the seeds of division. You go all the way back to Clinton's campaign when she was getting up on stage referring to people in Rust Belt America as a basket of deplorables because they dared to voice their support for Trump because the Democrats, which is meant to be a workers' party, had left them behind. What they want is to sow the seeds of division, because once they create that division, they have two teams, and they always set these teams up as good and evil. And once they have decided that one team is evil, and they've told them they're evil, and they've convinced everyone else that they are evil, it makes their job of taking over much easier. Now, I'm sure there are people who have seen the results of this and are slowly going, well, what the hell? This is not what I signed up for. And I'm sure there are many people who voted for Joe Biden primarily because they didn't support Biden per se, but they didn't particularly like Trump. And they are now seeing what the result of that has been. There are going to be people who are waking up, of course, but Biden, according to the polling numbers, is doing reasonably well at the moment. So there's obviously still a strong contingent of Americans who are not seeing what's going on.
Obviously, you trust the polls more than I do, Caleb. But let's jump across the pond a little bit, because the left, of course, have been running their socialist experiment in Europe for a very long time, and it was basically open borders and open welfare, open slather for welfare. Now, France has got a bit of a rebellion on their hands, where the military there are warning that there could be a civil war unless they reclaim their civilizational values. So this is a global effort to fight back, or it would appear to be.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, when you've got major officials in the army who are basically telling politicians you've got to step up your game here, because, of course, ultimately, if that kind of thing breaks out, it will be the army who will have to get involved and try and quell the trouble. But what you see, particularly in France, which is a good example, is this sort of rise of Islamism, or the allowance of Islamism. And, you know, you look back to February, when they were passing legislation in France that enshrined its secular republic status and set clear boundaries around what sort of power religion should have in France. And, you know, it was obviously targeted at Islamism. And there was quite an uprising from the Muslim population in France. Now, I mean, you've got to ask the question, if they're talking purely about Islamism, and I know Macron made this point at the time, I mean, ultimately, Islamism is going to be bad for the majority of Muslim people as well, because when they come through, when the extremists come through, and they find all the Muslims who've dared to have one beer in their life, you can bet your life that they're going to be targeted as well. You know, they're pretty indiscriminate in terms of who is and isn't an infidel. And even so, there was consternation at that kind of legislation. All they're trying to do is say that we are a secular nation, like most of the Western world, and it is the freedom that comes from being a secular nation that is not ruled by religion that allows you to live in such a free, wonderful society. That is not a controversial standpoint, and it shouldn't be a controversial standpoint.
But Caleb, this is the problem. It is, as soon as you start talking about protecting your borders or your values or your culture, the sorts of things that make a country an attractive place for a migrant to come, you are labelled a racist. You are labelled a Luddite or any other sort of pejorative slur that the left want to throw at you. How is it that we can surrender our values so willingly in so many countries under the face of what is a very obvious agenda?
Well, this is a question that's always baffled me. I mean, you know, I always figured that if I was moving to another country, presumably I'd be going there because it was better than the one I came from. You know, I'm seeking a better life. I want somewhere better to live. And so if you were escaping, you know, an extremist Muslim nation, for instance, why would you want to bring those beliefs to another country? I mean, you could have just stayed there. The reason that most migrants would come to a place like Australia or France or the US is because it is a free and happy nation where you are not dictated to on the basis of religion or any other sort of extreme ideology. That's the beauty of living in a place like this. And so rolling over to some degree, and it's always done in small bits, you know, they don't come in, or no one comes in and says, okay, well, we're going to have full-scale Islamism in Australia or France, right? They do it bit by bit because it's not going to be accepted in one large chunk. But a major part of that is convincing people that there is something wrong with the culture of their country, or that their country is racist. And so what they're able to do is radicalise basically people who were born in the country, who have lived in the country for a long time, into feeling ashamed of their country. They then create the hole that these people fill. But it's entirely counterproductive. Why would any migrant with any right mind want to make a country they've moved to just like the one they came from? Surely you've moved for a better life.
And Caleb, this white ante of the West, you know, the fifth columnists that are at work in Western nations, is emboldening a whole bunch of radicals. I mean, we saw what's happened in Israel this week. 150 rockets launched at Israel from Gaza by Hamas And Israel protects itself, and of course they're labelled the extremist or the terrorist by these lefty politicians like Marine Faruqi. There is something really wrong at work in this country and around the world when that sort of stuff passes for politics, isn't it?
Well, you would think, looking at a lot of the rhetoric around the Israel and Palestine conflict, that it was as though Palestine has never done anything wrong in its life, which is absolutely false. I mean, this whole thing goes back a long time. It's a religious war, basically, and this goes back decades. You look back to the Six-Day War, when Israel claimed Gaza. Now, Israel hung on to Gaza for a very long time. In the 90s, handed it back to Palestine. Terrible Israel handed Gaza back to Palestine. By 2005, they had moved all of their military out, all of their settlers out, and it was under complete control of Palestine. Israel did this willingly. It wasn't until 2007 when it flared up again, when Hamas, which is a terrorist, Islamist terrorist organisation, took control. And they immediately started antagonising Israel. Because if you read the Hamas charter, which was written in the 80s, it very clearly states that their objective is to exterminate all the Jews. They don't believe there should be any Jews in the Middle East, and they want to remove them. And that's ultimately what Hamas would do if it could.
That's why they've rejected the two-state solution many, many times. But they've been emboldened by the weakness of Biden again. Biden started throwing money again at the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, supporting these tin pot governments that are there, which are corrupt as all heck, and they fund and support terrorism. The weakness of the West is seeping into these extremist groups because they now feel that they can do whatever they like, including an emboldened China, including an emboldened Russia. It doesn't look good for the world, does it?
Well, this goes back to what I was saying before about having a tough cop on the beat. And that is not Joe Biden. I mean, whether you like it or not, the President of the United States, at least in the way the world is organised at the moment, is going to be the leader of the free world, basically. I mean, they hold an extreme amount of power, and they have a huge responsibility in terms of maintaining the geopolitical status of the West and making sure that things are stable. And, when you've got Israel, which it has faults. No one is denying that Israel has faults. Palestine has many faults as well. But when you have Western nations that are not backing the only democracy in the Middle East, far more of an ally than we would ever get out of Palestine. I mean, if Palestine took back all of the land on which Israel sits, they wouldn't be having a bar of the West at all. And they'd probably expand their charter from the extermination of the Jews to anyone who was an infidel. I mean, this is what Islamists play at. And so when you don't have a tough cop on the beat, you've got a weak President of the United States, it allows these people, it emboldens these people to carry on like pork chops.
Yeah, and unfortunately they're carrying on here as well. We saw this woman burning the Israeli flag. We've seen them jump up and down in support of the 9/11 atrocities, and we've got the likes of Marine Faruqi tweeting that Israel's a terrorist nation. It is a very sad state of affairs, and it all leads back to Joe Biden. Caleb Bond, thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, mate.